Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with red curry chicken and pumpkin soup. That's right, when people think of comfort food, they usually don't associate it with being interesting and exciting. Well, this incredibly tasty soup is the rare exception that's all those things, and at the same time will warm your heart and soothe your soul. So basically with this, we're going to stimulate you and relax you at the same time. So I hope you're ready. And what we'll do to get started is place some kind of soup pot or pan over high heat, into which we've drizzled a little bit of vegetable oil, followed by a couple pounds of boneless, skinless chicken thighs that I've cut into bite-sized pieces. And besides making soup, I was also testing out my beautiful new French Dutch oven, which I was thinking was non-stick, which is why I didn't bother getting my oil very hot. But it wasn't, which meant my chicken started sticking to the bottom. I mean, some pieces were fine and started to brown. But as you might be able to see, lots of smaller pieces are attaching themselves to the pan. But that's okay. To be honest, I don't even usually brown the chicken for this recipe, since it really doesn't make that much of a difference in the final results. And even though technique-wise that's not ideal, those little pieces that are sticking are browning, and will definitely add a little bit of extra flavor. So this little misstep was far from tragic. But anyway, I tried something and it didn't work, so I moved on. And I went ahead and tossed in half my diced red onions. Okay, we're actually going to save the other half for the end of the recipe. So I went ahead and stirred those in. And then I also at this point stirred in 1 spoon of brown sugar. Since I definitely think we need a little bit of sweetness to balance the heat, and by adding it now and sauteing it with the onions, it will actually start to brown and caramelize onto the bottom of the pan, which not only makes it a little less sweet, but it's also going to add some beautiful color to the soup. So we'll go ahead and let that cook for a few minutes. And while it does, we can go ahead and season this up with some freshly ground black pepper, a little touch of ground cumin, plus a big touch of kosher salt. And I went ahead and stirred that in. And I was actually pretty excited at what I was seeing in the bottom of the pan. Okay, besides helping brown the onions, that brown sugar seemed to have attached itself to those shreds of chicken, and things were caramelizing beautifully. But we don't want it to get too dark. So I quickly tossed in my ginger and garlic, because I do want to sizzle that stuff in this hot fat for at least a minute before we add any liquid. So that's what I did. And yes, in case you're wondering, this already smelled amazing. But anyway, like I said, we'll go ahead and cook that stirring for about a minute before adding most, but not all of our chicken broth. Okay, I like to reserve a couple cups to add later. And as usual, that stuff's going to deglaze the bottom, releasing all that amazing cooked on goodness. So we will stir that in and wait for this to come up to a boil still on high heat. At which point we'll go ahead and add 1 can of unsweetened coconut milk. And I should mention they make low-fat coconut milk, or at least that's what I've heard. Okay, I don't use it, and neither should you, especially for this recipe. And then besides the coconut milk, we'll also add a couple spoons of red curry paste, which depending on the brand and the strength, could range from a teaspoon to like a half a cup. So that's really going to depend on how intense and spicy the brand you're using is. But for the one I had, a couple big spoons was perfect. And one of these days we'll make a homemade one. But in the meantime, the good news is, pretty much every large grocery store carries that these days. And then speaking of spicy, to hedge my bets I went ahead and added a few shakes of cayenne, as well as 1 bay leaf. And then last but not least, we're also going to need a little splash of fish sauce, which is absolutely mandatory in this. And I almost forgot to add it, which would have been terrible. Although once I tasted it later I would have realized, and I could have put some in then. But anyway, we'll go ahead and stir that in. And then we'll reduce our heat to medium-low and simply let this simmer, stirring occasionally for 30 minutes. And while that's working, we can move on to prep our pumpkin. And this time I went with a Japanese pumpkin called kabocha, which is almost always a dark green in the store. But I found this beautiful orange one. But the inside's going to be the same color and flavor either way. And because these things are round and really, really hard, this first cut can be a little bit difficult and also dangerous. So what I like to do is get that blade started somewhere near the stem. And then I'll go ahead and pound on the top with the flat of my hand to drive it in nice and deep, at which point it should be fairly easy to finish the cut. And feel free to use a towel to pad the blow, and at no point should any of our fingers ever get anywhere near going under the blade. And the good news is once that first cut's made, and we can lay that down on the flat cut side, the rest of the cuts will be easier. And then once we've whacked a piece off, we'll go ahead and scrape out the seeds, and theoretically we will save those and roast them for a snack later. But that's another video, done by somebody else. And then once seeded, we can go ahead and peel this, which I always prefer to do after the cutting and the seeding, since a peeled pumpkin is a slippery pumpkin. So I like to do that last. And then what we'll do once we have a chunk of that prepped is go ahead and cut it into 2-inch pieces. I generally like to get something close to the size of my pieces of chicken. In other words, roughly soup spoon sized. Oh, and I should mention, these kabocha squash are generally fairly easy to find, but you could certainly also use a sugar pumpkin, or pie pumpkin as they're sometimes called, or really any other winter squash for that matter. Okay, the only thing you really don't want to use is a regular pumpkin, which are very watery and almost tasteless. But anyway, regardless of what we use, we'll go ahead and cut up about 1.5 pounds, which ended up being about half of this one. And I'm not going to show prepping a whole other piece again, but as I mentioned, once you make that first cut, because we have that nice big flat surface now, cutting those next pieces off is much easier. But anyway, once that's prepped, we'll go back and check our pot, which has been simmering for 30 minutes now. And before we add our pumpkin in, we're going to want to taste this. And that's so we have an idea of how much more salt we're going to have to add after we put our pumpkin in. And based on that taste, I decided to toss in another nice big pinch of salt. All right, don't forget that old saying, a bland squash is an evil squash. And then we'll also at this time add the rest of our chicken broth. And how much, of course, depends on how brothy you want this. But I think we want at least enough to cover that pumpkin we just added. But as usual, that exact amount will be up to you. I mean, you are, after all, the David Lee Roth of your broth. Not to mention the Eddie Van Halen of not Fallon. So if you want it nice and brothy, add more. Or if you want this a little thicker and more curry-like, don't. That is just you cooking. And then all we need to do next is let this simmer on medium-low, stirring occasionally, until our pieces of pumpkin are just barely tender. And what's a little bit surprising is that for something that's so dense and so hard when you cut it, it actually cooks surprisingly fast. So we'll want to start testing that after about 15 to 20 minutes. And like I said, what we're looking for is that it's just barely tender as tested with a fork. So I checked mine out and determined it was just right, which means we can move on to final production, which involves adding the other half of our diced red onions, as well as some diced red bell pepper and some freshly sliced green onions. And we will stir that in, and then only cook it for about 2 minutes. Okay, we want those veggies to retain a little bit of texture so that we create a beautiful contrast to that soft, tender pumpkin. Okay, roughly 60 to 65% of cooking is creating contrast. Okay, contrast in flavor, in texture, in temperature, etc. And that's it. After a couple minutes, we'll go ahead and turn off the heat, and we'll stir in a nice big handful of fresh herbs, which in my case is going to be cilantro and basil. And then once that's been stirred in, all we need to do is give this one final taste. And I determined mine was perfect, except it needed one more tiny pinch of salt, which you could also adjust with a little more fish sauce. But be careful, don't overdo it, because when it comes to fish sauce, what's done can never be undone. So I adjusted and gave it one final taste, and decided it was ready to serve up. And I don't know about you, but I think that's just an absolutely stunning color. Alright, some things you can just tell by looking at them, they're going to make you happy. And this is that. But wait, there's more. I like to garnish the top with some more herbs, and maybe a few more sliced green onions. And if we're feeling frisky, some thinly sliced serrano chilies. Or maybe some Thai bird chilies if we can get them. And that's it, that does not need anything else. Except for me to remove that one highly reflective, upside down cilantro leaf. Okay, that's better. And speaking of better, I highly, highly recommend you squeeze over some fresh lime juice before you enjoy this soup. Okay, that little bit of acidity is really going to help elevate all the flavors, as well as help cut through the richness of the coconut milk and the sweetness of the pumpkin. And that, my friends, is just an incredibly delicious, extremely vibrant and interesting and exciting, but also very, very comforting soup. And also probably really good for you. And as I mentioned earlier, any firm winter squash is going to work beautifully in this. But do yourself a favor and try to find kabocha. Since above and beyond their extremely pleasant, subtly sweet flavor, they also retain the most gorgeous firm texture, even when fully cooked through. But anyway, that's it. What we're calling red curry chicken and pumpkin soup. As the weather turns colder and wetter, and the days get shorter and darker, and maybe you start feeling those winter blues, or as the people that sell supplements call it, seasonal affective disorder, what you want to do is make a big pot of this. Although having said that, even if you're feeling great and everything's going just fine, you should go ahead and make a big pot of this anyway, since it's one of the most delicious chicken soups you will ever have, which is why I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.